Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Ghost Nurse.
I've worked the night shift at St. Gabriel's Hospital in Philadelphia for nearly 5 years. It's a job that's both grueling and strangely comforting. The quiet of the late hours gives a sense of peace, broken only by the occasional beep of machinery or the distant murmur of voices. I'm used to the oddities of the job, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened one fateful night. It started like any other shift. The hospital was relatively calm, the usual flow of patients coming in for various ailments. But then, around midnight, an emergency case arrived that seemed different. The admission forms were incomplete, and the only information we had about the patient was their name, Emily Thompson. The details of her condition were vague, but the urgency in the paramedics' eyes suggested something more sinister. Emily was a young woman, appearing to be in her late 20s. She was brought in under a shroud of secrecy, with no family or friends accompanying her. The paramedics were unusually tight-lipped, and the air around her had a strange, almost heavy quality to it. It wasn't the usual tension of an emergency. It felt like something more profound was at play. I was assigned to her care that night. The room assigned to her was in the older wing of the hospital, a part of the building that hadn't been used much lately. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the floors creaked with every step. There was something unsettling about that wing, but I attributed it to my overactive imagination. As I settled into my routine, checking her vitals and administering medication, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The room was colder than the rest of the hospital, despite the heating being on full blast. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, and I could swear I heard faint whispers echoing through the hallways. I tried to push these thoughts aside. It was a busy night, and I had more important things to focus on. But as the hours dragged on, the sense of unease grew stronger. Emily's condition was unstable, and despite our best efforts, she remained eerily calm, as if she were resigned to her fate. Around 3 a.m., things took a turn for the stranger. I was alone in the room, monitoring Emily's vitals when I noticed a figure standing in the doorway. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or perhaps a colleague, but when I looked up, there was no one there. I brushed it off as exhaustion. I had been working long hours, and the stress of the night had probably gotten to me. But the sense of being watched persisted. I could feel eyes on me, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, breathing and watching me as I moved through its hallways. I tried to focus on my tasks, but every so often, I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Shadows seemed to shift and move, and the temperature in Emily's room dropped inexplicably. It was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the growing sense of dread that clung to me. By the time my shift ended, I was thoroughly unnerved. Emily's condition had not improved, and her calm demeanor remained unchanged. As I prepared to leave, I couldn't help but glance back at her room. The shadows seemed darker than before, and the whispers seemed to follow me as I walked away. I told myself it was just the stress of the night, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a series of events that would challenge my understanding of reality and leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world beyond our own. The next night at St. Gabriel's Hospital was unusually quiet. The typical hum of activity seemed to be replaced by a stillness that was both unsettling and eerie. I was assigned to the same shift, and despite my lingering unease from the previous night, I tried to focus on my work. Emily Thompson's room was still in the older wing of the hospital. As I walked toward it, I felt a familiar chill settle over me. The hallway lights flickered intermittently, casting long, erratic shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. I tried to ignore it and proceeded with my duties, but the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on me. Around midnight, as I checked on Emily, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. It was almost as if I had been in that very room before, though I knew I hadn't. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath forming in the air. I adjusted the heater, but it did little to warm the room. That's when I heard it, a soft, calming voice coming from the hallway. I assumed it was another staff member or perhaps a visitor, but when I peeked out, I saw no one. The voice was gentle and soothing, but it carried a strange, almost otherworldly quality. I returned to Emily's room and continued my work, But the whispers persisted. They seemed to drift in and out, as if carried by an invisible breeze. As I worked, I caught sight of movement at the edge of my vision. A figure appeared in the doorway, a woman dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, with a white cap and apron. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination caused by fatigue. But the sensation of being watched grew stronger, and the voice continued to echo in the back of my mind. As the night wore on, I saw the figure again. This time, she was standing at Emily's bedside, her expression serene and focused. Her presence was so tangible that I could almost feel her warmth, despite the coldness in the room. I could see her fingers gently adjusting Emily's foredrip, her movements deliberate and caring. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing. I was about to call for assistance when the figure looked up at me, her eyes filled with a kind of quiet, reassuring sadness. She didn't speak, but there was a clear message in her gaze. She was here to help. Confused and frightened, I took a step closer. As I approached, the figure began to fade, her form dissolving into the shadows. The room felt colder than ever, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I was left alone with my thoughts, grappling with what I had just witnessed. In the following hours, I noticed something strange. Emily's condition, which had been steadily declining, seemed to improve. Her vitals stabilized, and she appeared more alert and responsive. It was as if a miraculous change had taken place overnight. Despite the improvement, I couldn't shake the image of the ghostly nurse from my mind. Who was she? Why was she appearing in the hospital? And why was she so focused on Emily? I felt a mix of awe and fear, unable to reconcile the supernatural with the medical reality I was accustomed to. As my shift came to an end, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The ghostly figure had left me with more questions than answers. I knew I had to find out more about this mysterious apparition, but I also felt an unsettling fear of what might be revealed. The hospital, once a place of routine, had become the setting for a haunting mystery that I was determined to unravel. The following day, I was haunted by the events of the previous night. My curiosity and fear had merged into a single, driving force. I needed to know more about the ghostly nurse who had appeared in Emily's room. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply significant about her presence. Once my shift ended, I decided to investigate. I started by searching through the hospital's archives and historical records. The older wing where Emily had been placed was part of the original hospital building, which had been around for over a century. I hoped that by delving into the hospital's past, I might find some clue about the ghostly nurse. I spent hours poring over dusty old files and brittle newspapers. There was a lot of information about the hospital's history, expansions, renovations, notable patients, but nothing about a nurse named Margaret Ellis or any ghostly occurrences. The records were sparse, and I was beginning to lose hope. Then, I stumbled upon an old photograph tucked away in a folder labeled Historical Archives. It was a black and white photo of the hospital staff from the 1950s. One nurse in particular caught my eye. She wore an old-fashioned uniform with a white cap and apron, very much like the apparition I had seen. Her face was serene, almost ethereal, and there was something about her expression that seemed familiar. I showed the photograph to an elderly janitor who had worked at the hospital for decades. He looked at the photo with a mix of recognition and sadness. "That's Margaret Ellis," he said softly. "She was one of the best nurses we ever had. Dedicated, kind-hearted, a real gem." I asked him for more information, and he told me Margaret had worked in the hospital during the 1950s. She had been involved in a tragic incident, a fire that had ravaged part of the old building. According to the stories, Margaret had perished in the fire while trying to save a young patient. Her bravery and sacrifice had become a part of hospital lore, but over the years, the story had faded into obscurity. Determined to learn more, I dug further. I found a newspaper article from the time detailing the fire. It described Margaret's heroism in vivid terms, how she had carried a child to safety before being caught in the blaze. The article praised her as a hero but also noted the tragic loss of life that night. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the ghostly nurse I had seen was indeed Margaret Ellis. Her spirit seemed to be bound to the hospital, continuing her work even after her death. But why was she still here? Why was she focused on Emily Thompson? I decided to visit the older wing of the hospital again, hoping to find more clues. The area had been largely unused, and the atmosphere was thick with history. As I walked through the corridors, I felt a chill run down my spine. The shadows seemed to move, and the whispers that had once been faint now seemed almost tangible. In one of the old supply rooms, I found a box of old medical records and personal effects. Among them was a small diary. The handwriting inside was elegant but shaky, and the entries were filled with Margaret's reflections on her patients, her work, and her deep sense of duty. The final entries were particularly haunting. They spoke of a growing sense of foreboding and an overwhelming need to protect her patients, even in death. Margaret's last words in the diary mentioned a promise she made, to watch over the hospital and its patients as long as she could. As I read the diary, I felt a profound sadness and respect for Margaret. Her story was one of selflessness and dedication, but it was also a tragic reminder of the fragility of life. I knew I had to uncover the truth behind her continued presence in the hospital, and what connection she had with Emily Thompson. With each new piece of information, the puzzle grew clearer, but the mystery deepened. Margaret Ellis had become more than a ghost. She was a guardian, a protector who refused to leave until her duty was complete. But what did that mean for Emily? And what was the nature of the spectral intervention that seemed to be saving lives? As the days passed, my obsession with Margaret Ellis and her connection to Emily Thompson only grew stronger. I spent every spare moment digging through old records, speaking with hospital staff, and trying to piece together the mystery. Emily's condition had improved dramatically, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. One night, during my shift, I made my way to Emily's room again. Despite the improvements, I felt a palpable tension in the air. The shadows in the hallway seemed darker, and the whispers from the past seemed to grow louder, almost as if they were trying to tell me something. As I entered the room, I was greeted by a chilling sight. Emily was lying peacefully in bed, but the temperature in the room had dropped significantly. My breath misted in the cold air, and I could feel an oppressive presence, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I was in the middle of checking her vitals when I heard it. The soft, soothing voice of Margaret Ellis, the same voice I had heard on previous nights. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a full, coherent sound, speaking words of reassurance and calm. I turned around, and there she was, standing at the foot of Emily's bed. Margaret's apparition was more vivid than before. Her uniform looked pristine, and her face was serene, filled with an almost maternal kindness. She seemed to be focused on Emily, her eyes filled with an intense, protective gaze. I felt a mixture of awe and terror as I watched her. "Margaret," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why are you here?" The ghostly nurse didn't respond verbally, but her presence conveyed a powerful sense of purpose. She reached out a translucent hand and gently touched Emily's forehead. As she did, the room seemed to brighten, and the chill dissipated. Emily's vitals, which had been unstable, stabilized before my eyes. Her breathing became steady, and her color improved. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying. I knew that Margaret was somehow influencing Emily's condition, but the sheer otherworldliness of the experience was overwhelming. I could see the effort it took for Margaret to maintain her form and continue her work. The strain was visible in the way her figure wavered, as if she was fighting to remain anchored to this world. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, Margaret began to fade. Her figure grew faint, her edges blurring into the surrounding shadows. I reached out instinctively, but she was already gone. The room returned to its usual state, and the temperature warmed up again. I stood there in stunned silence, grappling with the enormity of what I had just witnessed. Margaret Ellis wasn't just a ghost. She was an active, benevolent force, determined to continue her work even in death. Her presence was a blend of comfort and terror, a reminder of the thin line between life and the afterlife. As I finished my shift and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Margaret's intervention had saved Emily, but it raised even more questions. Why was Margaret so determined to protect Emily? Was there something specific about Emily's situation that resonated with her? The mystery of Margaret Ellis had deepened, and I knew I had to find answers. My encounters with her had turned the hospital into a place of profound mystery and unease. Each night, as I walked through the dimly lit corridors, I felt the weight of the unsolved puzzle pressing down on me. The hospital's past was intertwined with its present in a way that I hadn't fully understood until now. Margaret Ellis was more than just a story or a ghost. She was a symbol of the enduring spirit of care and sacrifice. But what was the true nature of her mission? And what would it take to uncover the full truth behind the ghost nurse's haunting presence? The following night, the hospital felt different, charged with an unsettling energy. My shift was approaching, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was about to happen. I felt a mix of anticipation and dread as I prepared to face whatever lay ahead. As I entered the hospital, the atmosphere was heavy with silence. The usual background noises were conspicuously absent, leaving only the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. I made my way to Emily's room, where she had been recovering steadily thanks to Margaret's unseen influence. When I reached the room, I noticed something unusual. The door was slightly ajar, and a soft light spilled into the hallway from within. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. Emily was sleeping peacefully, but the room was filled with a sense of palpable tension. Then, I saw her again. Margaret Ellis was standing beside Emily's bed, her figure more solid and radiant than before. She seemed to be deep in thought, her gaze fixed on the sleeping patient. There was a serene determination in her posture, as if she was preparing for something significant. I took a deep breath and approached cautiously. "Margaret," I said softly, "I need to understand why you're here. What are you trying to tell me?" Margaret's ghostly form turned towards me, and for the first time, she seemed to communicate with me directly. Her eyes were filled with a mix of sadness and urgency. She reached out, her hand hovering just above Emily's bed, and pointed towards a framed photograph on the bedside table. It was a picture of a young girl, no older than 10, with a bright, innocent smile. I recognized the girl instantly. It was a photograph of Emily's sister, who had passed away several years earlier. I had heard about the tragic accident that took her life, but it had never fully registered until now. Margaret's gaze then shifted to a small journal beside the photograph. I picked it up, and as I flipped through its pages, I found detailed entries about a young girl's struggle with a terminal illness. The journal's last entry was particularly poignant. It was written by Emily's sister, expressing a heartfelt wish for her sister to be happy and healthy, even if she couldn't be there herself. It became clear to me that Margaret's connection to Emily was not merely one of a dedicated nurse, but also a response to a deeper, more personal tragedy. Emily's sister had been one of Margaret's patients, and in her final moments, she had expressed a desire for someone to watch over her family. Margaret, bound by her own sense of duty and compassion, had taken on this role, even in death. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. Margaret was not just a lingering spirit but a guardian angel, honoring a promise made to a dying child. Her presence in the hospital was not only to help but to fulfill a promise made long ago, ensuring that Emily's family was watched over. As I processed this revelation, the room seemed to grow warmer. Margaret's figure began to waver, her form slowly dissolving into a gentle golden light. Her work here was done, and her mission had been accomplished. The intensity of her presence faded, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. I watched as Margaret's apparition vanished, and the light in the room dimmed to its usual level. Emily stirred slightly but remained asleep, her condition as stable as ever. I knew that Margaret's sacrifice had made a significant difference, and her spirit had finally found the peace it deserved. With a heavy heart and a newfound respect for the ghostly nurse, I left the room. The hospital seemed different, less haunted and more like a place of healing and hope. Margaret Ellis had left an indelible mark on my soul, reminding me of the unbreakable bonds of love and the enduring power of selfless acts. As I walked through the quiet hallways, I felt a profound sense of closure. The ghost nurse's story was one of both horror and heroism, a testament to the power of compassion even beyond death. The mystery had been resolved, but the memory of Margaret Ellis and her unwavering dedication would stay with me forever.
The child who never left.
I still remember my first night shift at the old pediatric hospital like it was yesterday. The building had been around for decades, and though it had been mostly closed for years, a small part of it was still in use for administrative purposes. The place was a labyrinth of creaking floors, dim lighting, and echoes that seemed to whisper secrets from the past. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of years gone by, and the stories that came with it. I had heard the rumors from the few staff members still working there. Strange noises, cold spots, and unsettling glimpses of something that wasn't quite right. But I was new, eager to prove myself, and more than willing to dismiss these as nothing more than urban legends. My shift started just after dusk. The hospital was mostly deserted, save for a few offices and rooms still in use. As I walked through the empty hallways, The silence was almost oppressive. The building's old charm was fading. Peeling wallpaper and dusty floors spoke of better days long gone. I made my rounds, checking the few remaining rooms and ensuring everything was in order. The pediatric wing, which had been closed off for over a decade, loomed in the background. I had been instructed never to go near it, a fact I had accepted with a casual nod, thinking it was just part of the job. Around midnight, I was alone at the nurses' station, where I tried to keep myself busy with paperwork. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows that danced on the walls. It was during one of these flickers that I heard it, a soft, distant giggle, like the kind a child might make while playing. I froze, straining to hear. The giggle was followed by the faint sound of footsteps, light and quick, running down the hallway. My heart began to race. I got up from my desk and walked to the source of the sound, but the hall was empty. I told myself it was nothing more than the building's old pipes or maybe my imagination running wild. I had heard enough about the haunted history of the place to be on edge. As I continued my rounds, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corners of my vision, shadows shifting or the flutter of a curtain. I told myself it was just the hospital's creaks and groans, but my nerves were getting the better of me. In the middle of my shift, I had to pass by the entrance to the pediatric wing. The door was heavy, barred, and clearly locked, but it gave off an unsettling aura. As I walked by, I thought I heard a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. I stopped and listened, but all I could hear was the low hum of the building's ventilation system. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up my spine. It was just a hospital, after all, old and a bit spooky maybe, but nothing more. I returned to the nurses' station, determined to finish my paperwork and get through the night. But as the hours dragged on, the eerie atmosphere seemed to thicken. The silence grew louder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and move of their own accord. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to see it. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. It wasn't long before the hospital's oppressive quiet began to wear on me. I found myself growing increasingly uneasy with every creak of the floorboards and every flicker of the lights. The once dismissed sounds of the night now felt like a prelude to something far more sinister. Around 2 a.m., the silence was shattered by a distinct sound, a child's laughter. It was faint, but it was unmistakably the kind of laughter you'd hear in a playground. I froze, my heart pounding. My mind raced through the possibilities. It couldn't be a child here. The pediatric wing had been closed off for years, and there were no families or patients on this floor. I stood up from my desk and followed the sound, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The laughter grew louder, and I began to feel a cold draft, as if the air itself was pushing against me. I made my way down a corridor I hadn't ventured into before, one that led to the old part of the hospital where the lights were particularly dim. As I turned a corner, I saw her, a young girl standing at the far end of the hallway. She was dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned hospital gown, her hair in disarray. For a moment, I just stood there, stunned. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes seemed to reflect an ancient sadness that I couldn't understand. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound firm but failing to hide the tremor in my voice. "Are you lost? What are you doing here?" The girl didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned and began to walk away from me. Her steps were almost too light to hear, and as she moved, she seemed to glide rather than walk. I hesitated for a moment before chasing after her, determined to find out what was going on. I followed her down the corridor, but as I rounded the corner where she had vanished, there was no sign of her. I searched the hallway, peering into empty rooms and looking behind corners, but she was gone. It was as if she had melted into the shadows. My breath was coming in quick, shallow bursts as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. I rubbed my eyes, hoping it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing games with me. I had heard of the hospital's haunted reputation, but seeing a ghostly child in the flesh was something entirely different. Returning to the nurses' station, I tried to steady my nerves. I attempted to focus on the paperwork, but every time I glanced up, I couldn't shake the image of the girl's sad, vacant eyes. I knew I had to be cautious. I didn't want to seem like a frightened rookie, but the fear was growing within me. Minutes turned into hours, and the unsettling feeling of being watched never left me. The cold draft returned, more pronounced this time, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Every creak and whisper seemed to be amplified in the stillness of the night. As the clock ticked toward the early hours of the morning, I decided to check the abandoned pediatric wing again. Maybe I could find some explanation or, at the very least, make sure everything was secure. I walked down the corridor with the heavy door leading to the old wing, each step echoing louder than the last. I stopped in front of the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The silence was deafening. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open, the rusty hinges creaking in protest. The air inside was colder, heavier, and filled with an eerie stillness. I stepped into the pediatric wing, my flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. Old, forgotten toys and medical equipment lay scattered around, untouched for years. The sight was disturbing, but what was more unsettling was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked through the dimly lit corridors, my flashlight flickering. I saw empty cribs and abandoned beds, each one a silent witness to the tragedies that had occurred here. And then, I heard it again, the soft, playful giggle of a child, coming from somewhere deep within the wing. My heart raced as I followed the sound, each step more hesitant than the last. The giggle grew louder, more insistent. I turned a corner and saw the girl again, standing in the middle of an old examination room. Her gaze met mine, and for a brief moment, I felt a connection, an overwhelming sense of sorrow and longing. Before I could react, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with my flashlight, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the blackness. The giggling ceased, and an icy chill filled the air. I was alone in the dark, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I could feel the girl's presence, a haunting echo of something lost and tragic. My only thought was to get out of there, away from the shadows that seemed to close in on me. I turned and stumbled back toward the door, desperate to escape the oppressive darkness of Ward 6. As I reached the corridor, the lights flickered back on, and the cold draft disappeared. The hospital seemed normal again, as if nothing had happened. But the image of the girl and the feeling of cold dread lingered, making it impossible to shake the feeling that something deeply wrong was happening in that hospital. The next day, I found it impossible to focus on anything other than the events of the previous night. I tried to convince myself that the ghostly girl was just a figment of my imagination, brought on by the eerie atmosphere of the old hospital. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. During my next shift, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I avoided the pediatric wing, though the image of that child's face was imprinted in my mind. The giggling, the cold drafts, it was all too real. I tried to keep busy with the usual tasks, but the memory of her haunting eyes was a constant distraction. I needed answers. My curiosity and fear got the better of me, and I decided to investigate the history of the hospital. I started digging through old records and archives, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. I spoke with a few longtime staff members, and while most of them were hesitant to discuss the subject, one elderly nurse finally opened up. She told me about the fire that had devastated Ward 6 many years ago. It was a tragic event that resulted in the deaths of several children, including a young girl who had been just 8 years old. The fire had started in the middle of the night, and despite the best efforts of the staff, they couldn't save the children trapped inside. The wing had been closed off since then, and the remains of the area were left to decay. The nurse's face grew somber as she recounted the details. She spoke of the horror and the heartache of losing so many young lives, and the rumor that the souls of the children who perished were still trapped in the abandoned wing. The girl I had seen, she told me, was just one of many restless spirits. That night, I couldn't ignore the pull to return to Ward 6. The sense of duty and the need for closure drove me back to that forsaken part of the hospital. As I approached the heavy barred door, my flashlight flickered erratically. I could hear the faint whispers of old conversations and the occasional, eerie creak of the building settling. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The hinges groaned in protest, and I stepped into the cold, stale air of the pediatric wing. The sight that greeted me was unsettling: crumbling walls, broken furniture, and dust-covered medical equipment. The place was a ghostly shell of what it once was. I walked slowly through the corridors, my flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. I could feel the oppressive weight of the place, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had occurred here. As I moved deeper into the wing, I began to hear the whispers again, just barely audible over the sound of my own footsteps. The whispers seemed to lead me to a specific room, an old examination room that looked particularly dilapidated. I pushed open the door, and the room was filled with broken toys and old medical charts. The room had an unsettling stillness, and as I entered, the temperature dropped noticeably. I scanned the room with my flashlight, trying to make sense of the eerie atmosphere. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of a child's laughter, coming from behind a large, dusty curtain. My heart raced as I approached, pulling back the curtain to reveal a small, empty bed, covered in dust and cobwebs. The laughter grew louder, more desperate, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I could see faint impressions on the bed, as if someone had been lying there recently. The sound of the giggle seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls and filling the room with a haunting melody. I reached out and touched the bed, feeling the cold fabric beneath my fingers. The giggling stopped abruptly, and a heavy silence filled the room. I could feel the presence of something, or someone, watching me, and I knew that whatever was here was not pleased with my intrusion. As I turned to leave, I saw her again. The young girl stood in the doorway, her eyes wide and sorrowful. She was no longer just a fleeting vision but a tangible presence, her form clearer than before. Her expression was one of profound sadness, and she extended a small, ghostly hand toward me. I tried to speak, to ask what she wanted, but my voice caught in my throat. The girl's eyes seemed to plead with me, and in that moment, I felt a deep sense of grief and empathy. I knew she was trapped, her spirit unable to move on from the tragedy that had claimed her life. In a flash, the room grew colder, and the ghostly figure of the girl began to fade. She left behind a lingering sense of sorrow, and the room fell into an oppressive silence once more. I backed away, feeling a mix of fear and pity, and I exited Ward 6 as quickly as I could. The encounter left me shaken and confused. I had seen the girl clearly, and her presence was both terrifying and heart-wrenching. I knew I needed to help her, to find a way to bring peace to the restless spirits of the hospital. The haunting of Ward 6 was far from over, and I was determined to uncover the truth and bring closure to the lost souls trapped within those walls. After my unsettling encounter with the ghostly girl in Ward 6, I couldn't get her sorrowful face out of my mind. The hospital's oppressive atmosphere seemed to have thickened, as if the walls themselves were mourning the lost souls trapped within. I was determined to uncover more about the tragic events that had transpired and to find a way to help the restless spirits. The next day, I returned to the hospital with renewed resolve. I was going to dig deeper into the hospital's records and try to piece together the full story of what happened in Ward 6. I spent hours sifting through old documents, incident reports, and news clippings from the time of the fire. It was a grueling task, but I was driven by the need to understand the tragedy that had left so many souls in torment. In the hospital archives, I came across an old newspaper article detailing the fire. It was a devastating account of the night the pediatric wing had been consumed by flames. The article mentioned several children who had perished, including a girl named Emily Carter, who was identified as one of the most tragic losses due to her age and the circumstances of her death. Emily's story struck me profoundly. She had been only 8 years old, and according to the article, she had been in the hospital for a routine procedure that had gone horribly wrong. The fire had started in the middle of the night, and despite the heroic efforts of the staff and firefighters, they couldn't reach the children in time. The article mentioned the deep sorrow of the families and the community's mourning for the lost lives. As I read through the article, I noticed a small detail that caught my attention. Emily's family had been deeply involved in trying to seek justice for their daughter. There were references to legal battles and public outcry over the hospital's negligence. It seemed clear that the pain and anger surrounding Emily's death had left a lasting impact on everyone involved. Determined to learn more, I sought out any surviving family members or individuals who might still be around. I managed to track down a relative of Emily's, a woman named Sarah who had been a teenager at the time of the fire. I arranged to meet her, hoping she could provide more insight into Emily's story and the circumstances surrounding her death. When I met Sarah, she was a kind but somber woman in her 60s. Her face showed signs of the heavy burden she carried from that tragic night. As she spoke, her eyes welled up with tears, and her voice trembled with emotion. Sarah told me about Emily's last days in the hospital. She described Emily as a sweet, innocent child who had been excited about a planned visit from her family on the day of the fire. The family had been waiting eagerly to see her, only to receive the devastating news that the hospital had caught fire and that Emily had perished along with several other children. The stories Sarah shared painted a vivid picture of the heartbreak and chaos that had unfolded. The fire had started due to a faulty electrical system, and despite the hospital's efforts to contain it, the blaze had spread rapidly. The staff had tried to save the children, but the fire was too intense. Many families were left without answers, their grief compounded by the sense of injustice. Sarah's account matched the eerie details I had encountered in the hospital. The sorrow and anger surrounding Emily's death had been palpable, and it was clear that her spirit, along with those of the other children, remained trapped in the hospital. As Sarah spoke, I realized that Emily's presence in the hospital wasn't just a haunting, it was a desperate cry for help and recognition. The children who had died that night were not at peace, and their spirits were lingering, bound by the unresolved pain and tragedy. Determined to bring some semblance of closure to Emily and the other lost souls, I returned to the hospital once more. I felt a profound sense of responsibility to help them find peace. Armed with the knowledge I had gained from Sarah and the archives, I planned to conduct a small ritual to honor the spirits and help them move on. That night, I entered Ward 6 with a renewed sense of purpose. I set up candles and spoke softly, acknowledging the tragic loss of the children and offering my apologies for the pain they had endured. I read aloud the details of their story, hoping to bring recognition to their suffering. As I finished the ritual, the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. The oppressive weight of the hospital lifted slightly, and a gentle calmness settled over the space. The cold drafts that had previously chilled me were gone, replaced by a soft warmth. In the quiet that followed, I felt a sense of relief and hope. I knew that while the tragedy of Ward 6 could never be fully erased, acknowledging it and honoring the lost souls might help them find the peace they so desperately needed. As I left the pediatric wing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a small difference, and that perhaps the spirits of the children had finally begun to rest. The night after my attempt to honor the spirits in Ward 6, I was apprehensive but hopeful. I had done everything I could to bring some semblance of peace to the lost souls that had haunted the hospital for so long. I hoped my efforts had made a difference, but I knew that only time would tell. The following day, as I went about my duties in the hospital, I noticed something different. The oppressive, chilling atmosphere in Ward 6 seemed to have lifted. It was as if the wing itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The whispers and shadows that had once plagued the halls were noticeably absent. Despite this change, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. I was determined to see if the ritual had truly made a difference or if the spirits were still lingering. That night, I decided to return to the hospital one last time, hoping to confirm whether my efforts had succeeded. As I made my way to Ward 6, I felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The hospital was quieter than usual, and the corridors seemed almost peaceful. I entered the abandoned pediatric wing with a sense of cautious optimism. The room where I had conducted the ritual was still as I had left it, with the candle's wax now dried and hardened. I stood in the center of the room and closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I focused on the lingering emotions and thoughts from the previous nights, the sorrow, the anger, and the sense of injustice that had haunted the place. I spoke softly, expressing my hope that the spirits had found some measure of peace and that they were now free to move on. As I spoke, I felt a gentle breeze pass through the room, carrying with it a faint, comforting warmth. It was as though the air itself was responding to my words, acknowledging the effort I had made. The atmosphere, which had once been so heavy and foreboding, now felt lighter and more serene. I opened my eyes and looked around, sensing a profound stillness. It was a quiet that seemed to carry with it a sense of finality and release. The room no longer felt haunted. It felt as though the spirits had finally found their way to rest. I couldn't help but feel a sense of profound relief and accomplishment. Before leaving, I took one last look around Ward 6. The once ominous space now seemed to hold a semblance of peace, a stark contrast to the terror that had previously permeated it. I hoped that this was a sign that the spirits, including the young girl who had appeared to me, were finally free from their torment. As I made my way out of the hospital, I took a moment to reflect on the journey I had been on. The experience had been harrowing and emotionally draining, but it had also been enlightening. I had faced my fears, confronted the unknown, and ultimately sought to help those in need. The next few days brought a sense of closure. The eerie occurrences in the hospital ceased, and the once terrifying Ward 6 was no longer a place of fear but of remembrance. The haunting presence that had plagued the hospital seemed to have vanished, leaving behind only the echoes of a tragic past. My encounter with the ghostly girl and the other lost souls had left an indelible mark on me. It was a reminder of the profound impact that unresolved grief and tragedy can have on both the living and the dead. I hoped that my efforts had brought some measure of solace to those who had suffered so greatly. As I moved on from my time at the hospital, I carried with me the memories of the children and the lessons learned from my haunting experience. The story of Ward 6 would remain with me, a testament to the power of empathy, the importance of acknowledging past tragedies, and the enduring hope for peace and resolution.
Night shift.
When I first started at St. Mary's Hospital, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The building was ancient, one of the oldest in the city, with its brick walls and creaky floors that seemed to have absorbed decades of suffering and silence. I had heard the stories, of course, every hospital has them, but I never put much stock in them. I was new, eager to prove myself, and ready for my first night shift. The air was thick with an eerie calmness that night. Most of the patients were already asleep, their breathing the only sound cutting through the sterile silence. The hospital felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I was assigned to do the rounds on the 3rd floor. It was mostly an empty wing now, used only for storage and occasional overflow patients. As I walked down the dimly lit hallway, I felt a strange sense of isolation, like I was the only living thing in that building. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, but I ignored it, blaming the hospital's age. That's when I first heard it, the faintest sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the exhaustion playing tricks on me. But as I stopped to listen, I could clearly make out the soft murmur of voices. I turned around, but the corridor behind me was empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just out of sight, watching me. I shook it off, reminding myself that it was just nerves. This was an old hospital. Of course, it would have creaks and groans. But when I approached room 317, something felt different. The door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had closed it earlier. I pushed it open, and the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, untouched. As I turned to leave, I saw it, a shadow, just at the edge of my vision, at the end of the hallway. It was a fleeting glimpse, barely more than a dark outline, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared down the empty corridor, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I quickly walked back to the nurse's station, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just another staff member. Maybe it was nothing at all. But deep down, I knew that whatever I had seen wasn't normal. It didn't feel right. As the hours passed, I couldn't stop thinking about that shadow, about the whispers that seemed to follow me wherever I went. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see it again, lurking just out of reach. But the night dragged on in eerie silence, and I finished my shift without any other strange occurrences. Still, when I left St. Mary's that morning, the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I brushed it off, blaming the exhaustion and the nerves of my first night shift. But even as I stepped into the bright morning sunlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that hospital was watching me, and that it wasn't done yet. My second night at St. Mary's felt different. The weight of what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, the night before still clung to me, but I was determined to shake it off. I told myself it was all in my head. New job, new stress. I was just tired. But as I walked into the hospital that night, a cold chill settled in my bones. It wasn't long into my shift when I heard them again. The whispers. Faint at first, like distant conversations echoing down the empty hallways. But this time, they seemed closer. The voices felt more distinct, as if they were right behind me, just out of reach. I spun around more than once, expecting to catch someone, anyone, in the act. But every time, I was alone. There was one place I hadn't ventured yet, the old, abandoned wing. Everyone avoided it. It had been closed for years, some structural damage or outdated equipment. At least that's what I'd been told. The other nurses liked to joke about it, saying it was haunted, but no one ever talked seriously about what might have happened there. All I knew was that the idea of going near it made the hair on my arms stand up. Tonight, though, something was drawing me closer. I don't know what it was. Curiosity or maybe something darker. The whispers seemed to be coming from that direction. I tried to resist, but I couldn't stop my feet from moving, each step pulling me further down the dimly lit corridor that led to the wing. When I reached the doors, they were chained shut with a rusted padlock. I could see through the small window. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but there was something unsettling about it. A cold draft seemed to seep from the cracks around the doorframe, carrying the faintest scent of decay. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again, a soft, unmistakable sound. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was laughter. The quiet, distant giggle of a child. My heart stopped. There were no children in this part of the hospital. In fact, there hadn't been any children's patients on this floor for years. I stood frozen, my pulse racing, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it. But the laughter came again, clearer this time, like it was coming from just on the other side of the door. A wave of nausea hit me. I backed away, forcing myself to walk, then run, back to the nurse's station. My hands were trembling when I reached the desk. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, this place had a way of getting under your skin. But something in me knew that what I had heard, what I had felt, wasn't just a trick of the mind. I asked one of the other nurses about the old wing later that night. She laughed at first, but when I pressed her, her expression turned serious. "You really don't want to go near there," she said, her voice low. "Strange things happen in that part of the hospital. It's been closed for a reason. Some people say it never should have been opened in the first place." I didn't ask any more questions after that. But as my shift dragged on, the feeling of being watched returned. This time it was stronger, more oppressive. Every time I passed the hallway leading to the abandoned wing, it felt like eyes were on me, watching my every move. And when the elevator doors opened on their own in the middle of the night, despite being locked off from use, I saw it again. The same shadow I had seen the night before, standing at the end of the corridor. But this time, it wasn't just watching. It was waiting. I couldn't get the shadow out of my head. No matter how hard I tried to focus on my tasks, every quiet moment was filled with dread, like something was closing in on me. The abandoned wing and the whispers, the laughter. None of it made sense. I told myself I wouldn't go back down that hallway. Not after what I saw. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more drawn I felt to it. It was around 2 a.m. when it happened again. I was making my rounds, checking in on patients in the intensive care unit. The halls were quiet, the only sounds being the soft beeping of heart monitors and the occasional murmur of a sleeping patient. But as I walked past room 317, the room that had felt wrong since my first shift, I felt that familiar cold chill again. The door, which had been closed when I last checked, was now slightly open, the faintest crack of light spilling out into the hallway. I knew I should have just closed it and moved on, but something stopped me. Something in my gut told me I had to look inside. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the machines. But it was empty. The bed, which had been occupied by an elderly man just hours ago, was now neatly made, as if no one had ever been there. A wave of confusion and fear washed over me. I checked the chart, certain I had made a mistake. But no, the patient had been scheduled to stay overnight. There was no record of him being transferred or discharged. He had just disappeared. Before I could process what I was seeing, a noise came from behind me. A soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the hallway was empty. That's when I saw it again. The shadow, standing just at the edge of the light, near the entrance to the abandoned wing. This time, it was clearer. Dark, tall, and unmistakably human-shaped, but there was something wrong about it. Something unnatural. It didn't move like a person. It just stood there, as if waiting for me to approach. My instinct was to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. And then the shadow began to drift, not walk, but glide, toward the doors of the abandoned wing. It stopped just before the chain-lock doors, and then, to my horror, I heard it. The unmistakable click of the lock disengaging. The doors creaked open. The draft that hit me was ice-cold, and the whispers, they flooded out like a rush of air. Louder now, clearer, like a chorus of voices speaking all at once. My pulse quickened as the laughter of the child returned, but this time it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. I stumbled back, my hand covering my mouth to stifle a scream. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. The shadow had disappeared into the darkness of the old wing, and the doors stood open, beckoning. Just as I was about to turn and run, something caught my eye. Lying on the floor in front of the open doors was a hospital bracelet. I bent down, hesitantly picking it up, and as I read the name etched into the band, my blood ran cold. It was the name of the patient from room 317, the one who was supposed to be in his bed. I dropped the bracelet and bolted down the hallway, not stopping until I reached the nurse's station. My hands were shaking as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. The whispers, the shadow, the patient who had vanished without a trace. It was all connected, somehow. I just didn't know how yet. One thing was certain, whatever was in that hospital, it was not something I could explain. And now, it knew I was aware of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was following me, watching me, waiting for me to return to the abandoned wing. I didn't sleep after that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow, the whispers echoed in my mind, and the image of the hospital bracelet lying in front of the open doors haunted me. I kept asking myself why I didn't just leave the hospital, quit the job, and never come back. But something held me there. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the feeling that whatever this thing was, it wouldn't let me leave even if I tried. The next night, I went in early. I needed answers. I was tired of being afraid of something I didn't understand, something I couldn't see clearly. I knew it was crazy, but I couldn't shake the thought that the abandoned wing held the key to everything. The shadow, the whispers, the laughter. It all seemed to be pulling me back there. I told myself I'd just take a look, just to prove to myself that there was nothing there. But deep down, I knew I was lying. Something was waiting for me, and this time, I wasn't going to run. By the time I arrived for my shift, the hospital was already steeped in the eerie quiet of the night. I couldn't help but feel like the walls themselves were watching me, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly as I walked the halls. I passed room 317 again. It was empty now, the bed stripped bare. No one had said anything about the missing patient. It was as if he had never existed. I took a deep breath and headed toward the abandoned wing. The closer I got, the more oppressive the air became, thick with a sense of dread. My heart pounded as I reached the chained doors, but to my surprise, the lock was back in place. I almost convinced myself it had all been in my head, that maybe the door had never opened on its own. But then, I saw it. The faint outline of the shadow standing just inside, visible through the tiny window on the door. Waiting. My hands trembled as I reached for the key I had stolen from the maintenance office earlier that night. I didn't know what I was doing, or why I was doing it, but something inside me told me this was the only way to stop whatever was happening. I slid the key into the lock and turned. The chain fell away with a metallic clank. As I opened the door, a wave of icy air hit me, carrying the unmistakable scent of mildew and decay. The whispers, which had been distant and faint, were now loud, constant, like hundreds of voices speaking over each other. I hesitated for a moment, but then I stepped inside. The corridor beyond was darker than I expected. The lights overhead flickered sporadically, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. The further I walked, the worse the smell became, like something had been rotting here for years. I could hear my own footsteps echoing back at me, but there was something wrong with the sound, like there was an extra set, faint and slightly delayed, as if someone was walking just behind me. I turned a corner and stopped dead in my tracks. In front of me, at the end of the hallway, was a door. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it, I could see a flickering light. The whispers seemed to be coming from that room, louder now, almost urgent. My body screamed at me to turn back, to run. But I was drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. I took slow, deliberate steps toward the door, my breath shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. As I approached, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the wood of the door, just below the handle, was a name. My name. I froze, staring at it in disbelief. It didn't make sense. How could it be there? Who could have put it there? My hands began to shake uncontrollably. The whispers were deafening now, and I could feel the cold presence of the shadow behind me, pressing closer. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as they wrapped around the handle. Slowly, I pushed it open. What I saw inside was worse than anything I could have imagined. The room was a makeshift operating room, with old, rusted surgical tools scattered across a blood-stained table. But what caught my attention was the figure in the corner, hunched over, bathed in the sickly glow of the flickering light. It was the shadow, but it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was solid, its form twisted and unnatural, its head slowly turning toward me. And then it spoke. Not with a voice, but with all the voices, the whispers I had heard for nights, now forming a single, horrifying word. Stay. The word stay echoed in my mind, the multitude of voices overlapping, forming a single command that seemed to root me in place. My legs refused to move. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, the weight of the room pressing down on me as though the very air had become thick with terror. The shadow... No, the thing in the corner slowly unfurled, its grotesque form shifting and contorting in ways that no human body should. Its head cocked to the side, as if studying me, its eyes, dark, hollow pits, boring into my soul. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape the nightmare I had willingly walked into. But my body betrayed me. The room seemed to stretch and warp around me, like the walls were closing in, twisting in on themselves. I could still hear the whispers, now circling me, louder, more insistent. They weren't just voices anymore. They were memories, fragments of lives lived and lost. I heard the old patient from 317, I heard the distant laughter of a child, and I heard my own voice. I tried to back away, but I was frozen. The figure in the corner had risen to its full height, its form impossibly tall, towering over me. It took a step forward, slow and deliberate. "You should have left," a voice, my own voice, whispered in my ear. I turned, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. The room felt alive now, pulsing with the energy of something ancient and malignant. I was trapped. In a flash of panic, I lunged for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it, the bang reverberating through the room. I pounded on it, desperate, but it wouldn't budge. I was locked in with this thing. Behind me, the whispering stopped. The silence was worse than the voices. I turned slowly, my back pressed against the door, as the shadow moved closer. Its face, if I could even call it that, was a swirling mass of darkness, like smoke caught in a shape that vaguely resembled human features. It leaned in, so close I could feel the cold radiating off of it, and then it spoke again. "You belong to us now." The words were like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The whispers returned, louder this time, deafening, screaming inside my skull. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the voices swarmed me, overlapping thoughts and memories that weren't my own. The shadow's presence loomed over me, growing darker, heavier. I felt the cold seeping into my skin, deeper and deeper, like it was pulling me into itself. I don't know how long I stayed there, on the floor, consumed by the madness of the whispers. But then, something shifted. A flicker of warmth cut through the cold, distant at first, but growing stronger. It was faint, but I recognized it, the sound of a bell. The soft chime of the hospital's call system. I grabbed onto that sound like a lifeline, forcing myself to focus on it, pulling myself out of the fog. Slowly, painfully, I lifted my head. The shadow had recoiled slightly, as if the noise had disturbed it. I took that as my chance. With all the strength I had left, I scrambled to my feet and rushed toward the door. My fingers fumbled with the handle, but this time it turned. The door swung open, and I stumbled into the hallway, the cold dissipating almost instantly. The whispers fell silent as I slammed the door behind me, my chest heaving, my heart pounding in my ears. I was free, but something told me it wasn't over. Not yet. The hospital was still eerily quiet, but it felt different now. The air was lighter, less oppressive. I forced myself to walk, my legs weak, every step feeling like I might collapse. As I reached the nurse's station, I saw it, the bell that had saved me. The patient in room 307 had called for help. I don't know how or why, but that simple sound had broken whatever hold the shadow had on me. I wanted to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But as I gathered my things, something caught my eye. The hallway leading to the abandoned wing was now shrouded in complete darkness. The doors had sealed shut, the chain locked firmly in place. I told myself I would never come back, that this was my last shift. But deep down, I knew the truth. The shadow wasn't done with me. It never would be.